Hey, this is Will Johncock from Sydney, Australia, and you're listening to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast.
Welcome to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast, a podcast dedicated to exploring the applied philosophy of traditional Stoicism. The College of Stoic Philosophers is an online school founded in 2008. We at the college endeavor to educate all who would be Stoics and Stoic philosophers who aspire to the good life within the world community. Podcast episodes will include discussions of Stoic history, application, interviews, and much more, all while having some fun, fate permitting. I'm your host, Mark Sterry. Thank you for tuning in and welcome to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast. Will Johncock, welcome to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast. How's it going today there, Will?
Very well. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for having me. I'm such a fan of the college, and I'm really looking forward to chatting with you.
Yes, thank you for being on the show. Where are you zooming in from?
Sydney, Australia. So we're in the morning here. It's a lovely rainy morning. You probably can't see out the window, but it's not classic Australian weather.
Gotcha. According to Will's website, Will writes on areas of philosophy, social theory, and sociology. Having completed a PhD and taught in these areas, he has authored 3 books, as well as numerous book chapters and articles. Is that about your story there, Will?
That is. That's where I've come from, let's say.
So I also have a music podcast. I've been listening to your other podcasts, Techno Tales and Mind Tuning. I just listened to your episode on Techno Tales on Voodoo Ray. That was very interesting.
Yeah, that's where techno, if we believe, as I do, that it originated in Detroit. That's the point at which Acid House, which originated in Chicago, then crossed the ocean and went to the UK in particular, and was there's a version of it that manifests in Manchester, and it's referred to as Acid House. And that episode is a famous Acid House track which took the UK in the late 90s by storm. They call it the second summer of love, and so it's a bit of an anthem, that track.
And it was interesting how you used spoken word for some of the vocal parts or whatever.
Yeah, I guess there was a time of great musical experimentation with sampling. Hip-hop was doing it a lot at the time too, of course it still is. And so they had this tiny little sample of a vocal, and they turned it into something quite psychedelic.
Yeah. Would you consider techno or that type of music Stoic music?
Oh, I haven't thought of that. I
haven't either until I just thought of it right now.
I don't know if I could consider techno Stoic music. I think techno at its heart is a very minimalistic kind of music, and so there might be something there to compare it with the kind of life that one might live if they're living stoically. The issue, I guess, with techno, of course, is that it's been associated in later generations with a somewhat hedonistic celebration, and that may not be consistent with Stoic principles.
So as I was waiting to start this podcast up, I've had a music podcast for 10 years, and I changed formats a variety of times. And I just got an email from Spotify regarding sound rights to some of the songs, even some of the folks I've had on that wrote the song. So I know that in your mind tuning podcasts, you've had bands such as Crash Test Dummies and things like that. You ever had any trouble with the copyright issues?
Not with Spotify, but definitely with YouTube. So when the episodes go through the various streaming services, YouTube will sometimes send a response saying that it's breached copyright rules and therefore it can't be uploaded there. But I haven't had that with Spotify, and I'm a little concerned to hear that you've received that, because I suspect I might also get one then in the future, a similar message.
Yep, 5 episodes are flagged this morning. So I had to write back, say I had permission from the artist to play this. So I've had it happen a number of times.
Yeah.
But not too bad I've had 400 and some episodes. So in general, it sticks. But just was curious about that. When I heard that, I was like, the Crash Test Dummy's like, wow, I don't think I could ever play that without getting in trouble.
Well, that's the thing. I suppose with Techno Tales, I made clear that it was an educational resource, and that was the purpose for the podcast. But I don't know if I definitely haven't made the same disclaimer for the other podcast, and I don't know if even making that disclaimer would get you off.
Not sure. Something that to be continued. So, Will, in general, how did you discover Stoicism?
I discovered it during my undergraduate studies. I was majoring in philosophy, and I was in one part of my studies focusing on classical ancient Greek philosophy and then ancient Roman as well. And the Stoics were mentioned in passing in commentaries in relation to Plato and Aristotle, essentially. And I didn't take much interest in it then. It was, as I said, just a footnote generally. I then encountered it more in my later years of my studies when I was doing 20th century continental philosophy, as they call it, so European French thinkers who were referencing it more and more in terms of what someone like Michel Foucault will call the art of the self, and there are other important thinkers from that era. And that pricked my interest a little more. I definitely didn't explore it intellectually. It wasn't a rigorous thing for me at that point until, I suppose, when there seemed to be a mass interest in the philosophy developing around 2010 for me. And I then rubbed up against the philosophy in the way that most people I did, I think, just through increased exposure. Once I did, I revisited the Stoics, and I'm a systems philosopher, so I'm interested in philosophies which look at structures to explain individual parts. And I found that the Stoics had a really strong systems focus. And so that was the starting point for me.
And when did you decide or feel educated enough to become a Stoic author?
Well, I was writing academic pieces during this period, and so I was already in the mode for writing academically. And the first thing I wrote on the Stoics integrated the Stoics with theory that I was already using in other fields. And so it was a great intellectual exercise. It required a lot of mental flexibility to compare the Stoics to modern thinkers in a completely different area. And once I started doing that, I realized how easily the Stoics spoke to modern concerns, particularly about social existence. But with this novel twist, as you will know, of looking at it through a physical theory. And I found that to be pretty unique, and definitely not something I was encountering in the modern social theories that I was looking at. So that was the starting point for me in terms of integrating the Stoics into my writing.
What's your writing process like? Do you come up for beyond the individual? Do you map out a beginning, middle, and end, and then kind of feature pieces? What's your writing process like? And how many hours a day would you work on something like that for people that are aspiring authors or aspiring Stoic authors?
Beyond the individual took 2 to 3 years to write, and it would fluctuate. At its most, it might be 12 hours a day, and at its least, it might be 1 or 2 hours per day. A lot of editing, a lot of rewriting, because I don't start with the conclusion. And that's something that the social science part of me has trained, is the idea that you collect your data and let your data tell the story. And so my writing process is collecting a lot of data. And when you're doing a literary analysis, which is what this was, sorry, your data is the text. And so my focus on the Stoics is the particular focus I have, which is on this social, structural, systemic interpretation of the Stoics, is based on what they tell us. This isn't my unconventional reading, let's say, but rather I'm simply focusing on a really prominent aspect of Stoic theory and drawing it out. And so my process for that is finding as many examples within the text, keeping context whilst I'm doing so, of these particular points. And one of them, of course, one of the points is that the Stoics are incredibly socially oriented. And then once I've developed a skeleton of all of these examples, I guess, from the texts, I then start to compare what are the differences between the different thinkers. What does Posidonius say versus what does Seneca say versus what does Epictetus say? So that then I can start to compare the different ways in which the Stoics think. It isn't meant to be a one. I'm not saying that the Stoics only have one particular impression regarding anything. Once I do that, then for a book like Beyond the Individual, I thought what I want to show particularly is how everything that we think about ourselves as being an individual thing is actually somehow a shared thing. And I thought, what are the ways in which we think of ourselves as highly individual in 2022 at the time? And I came up with the mind, the body, happiness, etc. And so those were my chapters, essentially. One chapter is on the mind, one chapter is on the body, one chapter is on happiness, things which we might conventionally discuss in highly individualistic terms. And instead I showed that for the Stoics, it's not highly individualistic.
What was your biggest surprise or discovery while you were writing on this journey from when you started the book to when you finished the book?
Just how emphatic the Stoics are regarding what we consider to be the self as being traced to something bigger than the self. I know that it was something that I'd encountered somewhat comprehensively because I had already written a book where I'd analyzed aspects of this and I'd filtered it through modern social theory and modern sociological theory. But when I was focusing on it for the research for Beyond the Individual, the thing that really astounded me was that, particularly with the daemon, when I looked at the daemon, it was staring us right in the face that this thing that we call the self, our mind, was a trace, as they say, a fragment of something universal. And once I really discussed that at length, the whole book kind of flourished because it was like the biggest challenge regarding the book had been tackled first. And if I was able to situate our individual minds within a broader body of mind, then as you would know from the book, the other pieces kind of fall into place. So that was surprising for me, actually, that whilst I was aware of it through having read the Stoics and having written about the Stoics previously, I hadn't necessarily fully digested just how emphatically collective our individual selves are.
Beyond the Individual, it's a key book for our college physics term. I help a lot with the development of the curriculum, and it's a huge part of the physics term. And Chris Fisher, our previous scholark and the founder, or the guy that, Chris Fisher, you've been on his show, the Excellent Stoics is on Fire podcast. He once told me it's one of the top 4 Stoic books of all time. I would agree. I recommend it all the time. For playing such a big part in our college and the curriculum, when did you first hear of the College of Stoic Philosophers?
It would have been between that period of when I first became aware of the Stoics, became more interested in Stoicism around 2010. I'm not sure exactly, and between that period and when I first started writing on the Stoics, so quite a few years later. I was on Chris's podcast, as you mentioned, and had a wonderful chat. That conversation that we shared was just, we were on the same wavelength. It really worked. And I was thrilled to hear that the college was interested in the work and was using it to some extent as well. Very flattering, but not surprising, I think, given that so many of the interpretations that I have seem to cohere with more traditionally oriented, let's call them, interpretations of Stoicism. There has definitely been a recent reinterpretation of Stoics, which I think is more individualistic. But when you do focus on the primary works, you see how other readings are opened up from it, and the physics has to be one of those things on which we focus if we're looking at Stoic theory. And I can see from the syllabus that the college uses that it would make sense that these, whether it's my work or someone else's work, that they would be applicable to what you do there. I think it's a wonderful resource, the college, actually.
So you say in the book, you say this notion of sharing social relations with and having responsibility for people we not only do not know, but will also never directly interact with proves to be a foundation of Stoic philosophy. What we found was that this book was focused on social oikeosis and cosmopolitanism that I know the founder, Eric Wiegard, felt was one of the primary goals of practicing Stoicism. Where did you decide to focus on the social oikeosis end of things?
Again, it was through canvassing all the eras of the ancient works and recognizing this consistency, whether they referred to it in similar ways or not. The message was the same, which was that you are bound to your fellow creatures, and you're not bound to each other in an altruistic or selfless way. You're bound to other people because you are each constituted in the same way and by the same thing. No one is self-originating. Everyone has originated as an expression of this universal body that the Stoics talked about. And so it just became unavoidable, really, for me to focus on this, given my interest as well. Let's take that into account. I have a pre-existing interest in this kind of interpretation. But the fact that for the Stoics, everything about ourselves physically, everything about ourselves mentally has a material trace to a bigger body, and everyone else's mentality and physicality has a trace to a greater universal source, meant that we are all, as the Stoics will say, particularly Seneca, we share these relationships of kin. We're one and the same in this regard. And so what that means is when you're talking about a social kind of responsibility to each other, there are two forms of the social for the Stoic, as I mentioned in the book. One is we are, in a very practical way, we're required to participate in town square activities. It's a town square philosophy, right? It's not a book philosophy. It's meant to be one that's lived practically, and that is enacted through the ways that you interact with each other. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that by default we are social, where by social they mean we share constitutions with each other. And that's what I've just indicated. These physical traces that are us are physical traces of a greater physical system. So those two aspects of the social are really important when understanding why, for the Stoics, we are by default, in many ways, social.
So you also say in the book, the greater source of our rationality, to which the Stoics instead refer, is the entire universe itself. For the Stoics, the universe is a thinking, rational being. Do you find that concept hard to grasp for people new to Stoicism?
Definitely, using like the word thinking, ascribing thinking to a collective body like the universe as a whole is counterintuitive. It's not how we grow up thinking about thinking. We attribute thinking to individual nodes within a system, and those nodes are things like us. So to say that the body is the body that is the universal body, which is, let's just call it the world, to call that thinking is hard to digest. You need to read that interpretation through the rest of Stoic theory. What the Stoics mean by thinking is rationalized. And rationalized is the key to understanding the consistency between us and the universe. They call us rational beings, after all, and they say that the universe is rational. Now, what do the Stoics actually mean by rational? And this is probably the most important, I think. Once I understood this part of the Stoic thinking, the rest unfolded. And what the Stoics mean by rationality is order, the word order. And we see that understanding of rationality for the Stoics when they talk about the regularity of the celestial rhythms. So the Stoics are empiricists, first and foremost. They're scientists. They view the world and they take results. They view and record how the planets revolve in similar ways over time with repetitive rhythms. They talk about the ecological flourishings of flowers and plants and the like, doing the same things in the same seasons. So they're watching this, they're observing the patterns, they're recording the patterns, and then from that, they're interpreting that the world is ordered. It's not a chaotic mess. It's doing things in regularity, consistency. And these are adjectives that we can use in a conventional way when we talk about someone being Stoic. They're consistent, they're regular, they're reliable. The Stoics thought about the universe in this way as well. And then for us, we are expressions of this universal order, this universal rationality. We have rationality as a result. Our rationality, interestingly, there is twofold, because for the Stoics, we both possess rationality in that we have the capacity to think, and we have the capacity to reflect on ourselves as thinking beings. And we do that because we have a mind. That mind is the trace of a universal rationality. So there's that, but we're also not just the holders of rationality, but we are rationalized. And what that means is that we are, just like the flowers and just like the celestial bodies, we are expressions of this rational system, this overall body. And so we are, as Marcus Aurelius will say, we're like limbs of a rational body. And so we at once possess rationality, if we want to use that term, possess, and we are expressions of rationality as well.
Fascinating. Well said. I love that. Recently, I'm obsessed with Spinoza. So one thing else you say in the book, you say, when engaging in Stoicism, the requirement here is to relinquish any preconception of God as that which transcends the world and instead appreciate God as immanent to it. So do you mind for the podcast explaining Stoic pantheism?
Yeah. This is such a hot topic. The last few years, it really has caused some contention within the Stoic community. I spoke at the Melbourne Stoic X conference last year, and probably the point which provided the most animation in the room was when we discussed the role of God in Stoicism. And there is a contemporary push from some scholars, particularly with scientific backgrounds, to eradicate from the philosophy its divine terminology. So words like God and divine itself and Zeus and so on. This is in order to make it, in their words, more relevant to the modern era. And this is not something with which I agree at all. I think it's incredibly important to keep the vernacular that the Stoics originally used, and that vernacular does involve what we consider to be in 2025 theological or theologically oriented terms. Now, when we think of that theology, when we think of God in Stoicism, it isn't of a transcendent creator sitting above the creation, metaphysically outside the world. This is instead, as you've indicated, a pantheistic theology. And pantheism says that God is in and amongst the world that we live. The material stuff of the flesh of the world that we live is God itself. And for the Stoics, if we can return to an earlier point, their evidence for this is the order of the world. They say that the world wouldn't be ordered, wouldn't be rationalized unless it was God itself doing that perfect ordering and rationalizing. So God is in and amongst the world rather than transcending the world. It's an early interpretation of pantheism that has many different forms since, but the message is the same for the Stoics across the eras, in that you can be both what I called previously an empiricist, which is a scientific analyzer of the world. You observe the world, you take results, you come to conclusions. So you can be an empiricist and a theist simultaneously. And you can believe that the God is Zeus, as they will say. That you can believe that the world is divine. And that's one of the terms that they will use to justify their interpretation of why things are so ordered.
Do you think that with writings by Philip Goff and David Chalmers and the rise of panpsychism, do you think that helps sell it to the scientist folks?
Maybe. It's a good point. Yeah, it might put it in modern vernacular, and it might make it more palatable, particularly to philosophically oriented readers or commentators, to think about it in that way. Again, like that, if we can go back to one of your earlier questions, that term, what does it mean to think of the world as thinking? It requires such a shift from the way in which we typically think about thinking growing up. What is sentient comes into play as well regarding this. And for the Stoics, if they're going to be digestible in the modern era, I get that some commentators would have concerns about these points, and they'd want to change the wording. They'd want to compare it to things like panpsychism. It depends whether or not this is okay. Would depend, I suppose, on how far it takes us away from the philosophy itself. One of the motivations for writing Beyond the Individual was what I believed to be a modern trend to skew the philosophy in a certain way, and that is into a self-help kind of genre of literature. And whilst I don't want to discount the proven results of using Stoicism as a psychological technique, because quite often when it's used in self-help ways, it's used not as a philosophy, but it's used as a psychology and a way to manage your anxieties, a way to manage your adverse mental states. And I'm not discounting the effect of that, because it does seem to work. And there's plenty of better people than I who can speak to this. So it's not that I want to negate those, and I say this in the book. I don't want to negate these kinds of interpretations, but rather just to complement that increasing body of works with one reading that is more focused on something other than the self. And so panpsychism would seemingly actually cohere more with what I'm talking about, if it's looking at the mind and thought as not being exclusively the domain of individual actors, but rather where the individual acting is an expression of a greater consciousness.
Growing up a cafeteria Catholic in small town Wisconsin, and then later on in life developing an interest into Stoicism. And when I first heard Chris's groundbreaking podcast, Stoicism on Fire, and he was using words like God and all that, it was a little spooky. And then when I went through college and Eric Wiegard said that Stoics were very similar to panpsychist, though he thought it was an ugly word, that then I considered myself a panpsychist. And now, years into my development, I think I'm a pantheist. Chris Fisher was right when he said where panpsychist, that's not exactly what the Stoics were, but it's it's inching towards what they were thinking.
Yeah. The key issue with this, let's just say we wanted to put it in these terms, the key issue would be, can we maintain the materiality of the rational order for the Stoics? The fact that the Stoics coincide our mental processes with physical processes is quite novel. And for the universal body to be a singular thinking entity, it can only do that because it is also a singular physical entity, which for me makes sense, given that I associate the mind with the brain and would say that the mind and the brain are one and the same. And so if the Stoics are thinking in the way in which the mind is the seat of rationality, and rationality is a physical phenomenon, then the mind and the physical phenomenon become one. And so then if panpsychism was to be integrated into this interpretation, it would only work for the Stoics if it was a panpsychic reading of consciousness, where consciousness was a physical phenomenon. A materialistic panpsychism would be more likely comparable to the Stoics than other forms of panpsychism.
Gotcha. And for listeners that don't know what panpsychism is, in a nutshell, it's a little bit of consciousness in everything. Like the Stoics said, there's a little bit of pneuma in everything, and the humans have the most amount of it, most related to the universe.
Yeah, do you teach panpsychism in the physics part of the college syllabus?
Yes, we have the Nagel book in there, Mind and Cosmos, and also we have a Stoic Cosmic Consciousness course that I came up with a couple years ago that really delves into that.
How do the students respond to the panpsychic element of the syllabus?
Like I said, like it seems easier to digest. The book we use for pantheism, it does get a little, for lack of a better word, little squirrely, where they're worshiping rocks and doing kind of oddball stuff. And it seems to bridge that until you realize what the Stoics' version of pantheism was.
Right. Yeah, I suppose like pantheism, panpsychism, two incredibly different things, as you know. But I can definitely see the advantages of incorporating a panpsychist interpretation. It would put it into, I think, terms which are more digestible for modern thinkers sometimes, because we don't have a lot as well of literature regarding the ancient Stoic idea of this. They are reducing things to words such as rationalism, and that needs a lot of unpacking. And panpsychism, I suppose, would give us the capacity to do a little more work with that, given there's so much more literature on the topic.
As we move through Posidonius' Stoicism, we encounter the sense that the daimon provides genuine guidance for each of us, and that this guidance derives from a rational source that is beyond ourselves. Do you mind explaining what the Stoic daimon is from your perspective?
Yeah, so the daimon is this, it has various definitions. One is of a guardian spirit, which tells us not what to do, but tells us what we shouldn't do. It advises us in that way. There are other roles that the daemon or the daimon plays, but essentially its composition is what is most interesting to me, which is that it is within our minds, and it is effectively permeating our minds. In some regard, it might be our minds, depending on whose interpretation you take. And it is a trace of, as I've said, something bigger than the self. So this thing which guides you is a fragment, is another word that is used, of a universal mind. And I think it's Epictetus who describes how when you are in, it might not be Epictetus, it might be Epictetus, who says when you're in your room alone, you are not alone. And one of the reasons you are not alone, according to Heraclitus, is because of the theory of the daimon and the idea that you have this trace of a universal thinking entity, which is God, within you, and which is you. The ramifications of this theory for individual interpretations of the self become quite problematic, because if the thing that you're thinking with, and if the thing that is you're using to guide you isn't entirely you, but rather can be traced to something beyond you, then all of a sudden, the distinction between you and the universal body becomes quite ambiguous. And indeed, the fact that you are an individual author of your decisions also, I think, and we'll argue in the book, is hard to manage. And that is one of the contestations I think the book makes to more modern literature, not so much from the academy, but more from public and trade interpretations, which will focus more on use Stoic philosophy to take control of yourself. Use Stoic philosophy to defy the way that the world tries to steer you in certain ways, and instead think individually. And what the focus on the daimon does for me is it says that distinction between you and this outside world is kind of rendered redundant, because you are that world. And the world that you see around you, you are a trace of something which that world is, and you are also. It's I think one of the keys to understanding the mental side of the Stoics. And without understanding the role of the daimon and how it is traced to something beyond us, I don't think you can necessarily understand the connection between yourself and your fellow beings, and yourself and other things and the environment in which you are living too.
Fascinating. Next question is from kind of a fanboy perspective. You say in the book, the Stoics evidently draw inspiration from the pre-Socratic Heraclitus in holding that God is embodied and universally ordered. What's your thoughts on, as we call it at the college, the grandfather of Stoic physics, Heraclitus?
Yeah. So how do you teach it in the college? Can I ask?
Yeah, I actually developed a course called On Heraclitus because he had a book called On Nature and came up with a course called On Heraclitus. And basically, how it started when I was taking Stoic physics years ago, the founder, Eric Wiegard, would tell me that he would wander around when he had insomnia. He would just wander around in his head and try to memorize as many Heraclitus fragments as he possibly could. And then he would talking about how Zeno, when he was coming up with Stoicism, talked to the Oracle of Delphi, and that the Oracle of the Delphi had said something in regards to lie with the dead or sleep with the dead, and Zeno took that as study philosophers before you, and he discovered Heraclitus. That became the framework of Stoic physics. So basically, for the course, it is like a basic introduction of Heraclitus. Then it is A.A. Long, a big Stoic mind, author. We delve into what he thinks about Heraclitus and interprets his fragments, and then it goes to a variety of podcasts on Heraclitus and what a variety of other thinkers think about Heraclitus. And then it goes, the part 4 would be a student would make up their own mind. They would take a number of Heraclitus fragments and come up with what they think he means. And then by the end, the students become a Heraclitus and literally write 5 fragments in the style and in the themes that Heraclitus presented.
Wow.
So it's a pretty deep course, but it's a ton of fun.
Yeah. And so it's the focus then on Heraclitus's notion of nature? Is that the
whole kit and caboodle, his whole life, and how it can relate to Stoicism, how it doesn't relate to Stoicism, mostly just learning a lot about him, his fragments, and how, for me, it can really underscore a lot of my Stoic practice.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that I mention that, and it's only very briefly that I do, is that we can't look at the Stoics as having conceived of their positions from nowhere. Their ideas are coming or building on preceding ideas. And Heraclitus is one of those inspirations. And particularly Heraclitus's characterization of nature and our relationship to nature and the ways in which we are material things. And so I probably don't do it in the book enough, but the way we can trace Stoic ideas to their predecessors is quite important, I think, in order that we don't start them in a vacuum, so to speak. I know there's the great theories about, or great understandings, narratives, I should call them, about how the philosophy begins and the shipwreck, and it's quite romantic, and it does seem like it comes from nothing. But there are such important informants to Stoicism, and Plato and Aristotle need to be taken into account here as well. I suppose we're looking at an area of the world where you've got such competing ideas in such close geographical proximity, with Epicurus being there, as well as Plato and Aristotle, as I've mentioned before. And so it's a real melting pot, to use a cliche. And from this, we get one version of philosophy, which is Stoic philosophy. And the trace to Heraclitus is definitely concerning that emphasis on nature, a consciousness of nature, and the physicality of our relationship as well.
Do you consider yourself a practicing Stoic?
No.
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 Do you mind expanding on that?
I know that's going to be controversial to a Stoic podcast. The parts of Stoicism, I adopt some parts of Stoicism. So, and the systems parts of Stoicism are incredibly inspiring to me. I think when my reading of the Stoics is that if you are always conscious of yourself as a part to a whole, and that's something I try to think about all the time, that for me is a very practical application of the theory. And indeed, I find that the reminder from Marcus Aurelius and from Epictetus and from others to always think of yourself as this tiny fragment of a whole. And I try to do that every day. I try to do that with everything I do. I try to be humble. I try to think about the fact that I don't author necessarily everything about myself, but rather I'm an expression of something. These tenets are ones that I hold dear. There are other aspects of Stoicism that I probably don't subscribe to, and I definitely don't apply. One is the distinction between the internal and the external. And I think it's probably lazy wording from the Stoics, because when the Stoics talk about our internal mind and the external world, they will then contradict that with their understanding of the internal mind as being an expression of the world. And so, again, I think, like I just said, the wording around this needs refinement. And without that refinement, I'm not going to rewrite the Stoics, as I've said some people are trying to do regarding removing the divine terminology. But I think there are aspects of the wording which are less rigorous than philosophies I'm working with in the present day. And so for those reasons, I don't subscribe wholly to the philosophy. But there are aspects of it which I find, as I've said, incredibly important, the systemic part being one of it. If I can just say one other thing regarding the internal-external thing. If the world is rational and we are an expression of this rational order, then when we are thinking with our fragment of that rational order, which is our mind, our daemon, when we are thinking with that, then the world around us isn't an external world anyway, because we are embedded within it as a rational expression of it. We are part of it. And so that's where the external-internal division falls away entirely. Indeed, externality only manifests when, for the Stoics, we have the capacity to behave irrationally and to think irrationally. And it's only then that we become what various thinkers will call a cyst on the world or a cancer on the world, and we will separate ourselves from the world. This is another reason why I'm not a Stoic, is because I don't think within a system you can extract yourself from the system in the way that they argue. And so whilst you might be an abnormal expression of the system, whilst you might be an adverse expression of the system, I don't think you can externalize yourself from the system. You are just you're sharing a different kind of relationship with the system. And so that doesn't mean the Stoics aren't right. This is, that they've done a lot of empirical work that I haven't done, as I've mentioned, in their observations of the patterns, and they probably have a more comprehensive understanding of the mind than I do. So even though it was so long ago, so I'm not saying that I'm right and they're wrong. It's just that my worldview in some parts really, really strongly coheres with the Stoics, and in other parts there are points of tension.
All good. Thank you so much for sharing that. I do appreciate that. What's your next book you're going to work on?
It won't be Stoicism, actually. I say that, but I have my own publishing house, Planktos Press, and Planktos Press is dedicated to translating into English works from French, which have previously not been translated or have been translated so long ago that the translations are effectively out of date. And I've already worked on one particular Stoic book as part of that project. I should have to Julie Favre, and it's Our Duty to Others. And in that work, she was a French educator, and in that work, she looks at the way that the Stoics discuss our interpersonal ethics, essentially. And so, as part of Planktos Press, I am translating these works, and another work that will be coming up is a piece on the Stoics by Leontine Zanta, and it has never been translated into English. And so that will be a Stoic-focused work. But apart from that, of my own writing, I think my next book will be going back to what were my original passions, which is continental European philosophy.
That's great. So I know you're a musician, or previously you were a musician, and you have some music podcasts. Have you ever considered making Beyond the Individual a techno house opera?
Where, so I know. Look, I've never made a. I see you're a musician, and I'm looking forward to actually exploring some of your music. I've in a past life I was a musician too, but I never programmed a drum machine and used a synth and made techno or house music. It was always just guitar based stuff. So so for me to turn Beyond the Individual into a I'd probably be more likely or more capable of turning into a rock opera or something like that.
That is awesome. What's your thoughts?
If you have any ideas
I'll let you know.
Conversion,
what's your thoughts on Ozzy Osbourne passing away?
It's a real moment in time, isn't it? You see how influential he was, and you see how like the outpouring from all sides of the music world. Sometimes people only from a genre will respond to something like this, right? But I've seen electronic music artists respond. I've seen obviously rock people respond. Seen politicians respond. It's he's one of those people that transcended their industry, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Will Johncock, thanks for being on the podcast. What are your socials for people who want to follow you, or your website for people to check out more of your work?
So my website is willjohncock.com. That's WILLJOHNCOCK.com. And I use Instagram as well, and I have that under my name, but that's probably not that interesting. So you can follow anything I'm doing on my website.
Thank you for tuning in to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast. Please visit thecollegeofstoicphilosophers.org for information on the college, e-journal, and course offerings. Till next time, pro college.